Okay, so today I'll start on this new topic on communication. I have posted the lecture slides and main readings, and I'll post some more material, some supplementary readings and references. And the lecture videos will appear as we go along, as usual. So before I start on this, any questions?
So I have a question from
Yeah.
the previous class.
Yeah.
So once in the last class, we saw that once the monetary benefit crosses the Y2 level of income, then we saw a downward jump in both the the low cost generous types and the low cost greedy types.
Yeah.
So why is that we saw a downward jump in the greedy types the red curve? Is it because they want to portray to be the generous ones?
I'll tell you. Okay, so you're referring to this picture, let's say, and there's the downward jump in the rate of pro-social behavior of both types. Yeah, that's what you want to know. Now, remember how these equilibria are constructed, okay? Both in zone 2 and in zone 3, some of the low-cost greedy types contribute or act pro-socially, right? So they use mixed strategies, they randomize. So throughout, both in these two zones, the low-cost greedy type has to be indifferent between the two actions, right?
Yes.
Now, what keeps them indifferent is the reputation, the equilibrium reputation being pegged at the appropriate level. So if you increase Y in a continuous fashion, the reputation in equilibrium has to adjust to keep these greedy guys indifferent between actions 0 and 1. Okay, so the reputation function has to be continuous, including at Y2. Okay, so that's the first part of my argument in response to your question. So see if you are convinced by that. Yes. Throughout, we are using the indifference property of these low-cost greedy types. Okay, that's as much true in zone 2 as in zone 3. They're randomizing. So around this point, the reputation has to be continuous, right? If you increase the monetary price slightly, the reputation has to adjust only slightly to preserve the indifference. So there's continuity in the reputation, equilibrium reputation function around Y2, okay? Now, remember, the reputation is calculated based on Bayes' rule, okay? What fraction of generous types are acting pro-socially and what fraction of greedy types are acting pro-socially. It's derived from those two fractions, okay? So if around Y2, if there's a sudden drop in the fraction of generous people who are taking pro-social actions, and if the other fraction did not jump down also, right? If the other fraction, if the red curve, for example, were continuous, then since the blue curve has a discontinuous downward jump, our reputation function would have suffered a discontinuous downward jump too. All of a sudden, if a whole mass of generous people drop out of pro-social behavior, but there's no corresponding change among the greedy ones, their fraction has adjusted continuously, then this reputation will have a discontinuous downward jump. But I just argued that that can't be true. To preserve indifference, the reputation has to change in a continuous manner. So that means that this downward jump among the generous types has to be matched by an appropriate downward jump also among the greedy types. So that the ratio of greedy and generous among the contributors, among the ones acting pro-socially, that ratio does not discontinuously change. Yes?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I get it now. Thank you, sir. Also, sir, when we say that it's this downward jump is called as crowding out phenomena, we are referring to both the types, right?
Yes. Yes. In the aggregate as well as within the subgroups.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? Okay, so I'll start on the new topic. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. Okay, so in many spheres of social, economic interactions, we often find that there's verbal communication. Okay, before people play a game, before they take some actions, there is communication between them. And the sort of overarching question in this topic is what role does this sort of communication play? To what extent can it promote efficiency and so on? So here's some examples. In international relations, of course, there are threats and promises which are kind of verbal. Yes. We will not allow a nuclear Iran or North Korea. American presidents often thunder, right? It's a verbal threat. Will they actually follow up? How much will they risk? How much military resources will they put into that effort? That's anybody's guess. Election season is full of verbal promises, right? There are campaign promises. These promises are not legally binding. What if a politician gets elected and then doesn't fulfill the promise? A prominent example is George Bush, the senior George Bush, American president. In 1988, when he was vice president then, vice president to Reagan, and he was running as president himself in 1988. And he was from the Republican Party, so he pushed the line that, we want to keep taxes low. And in some TV program, a journalist said, come on the camera, looking straight into the camera, tell us that he will not raise taxes. And so George Bush said, read my lips, no more taxes. Okay. Now then he got elected and, the economy turned south, there was some recession, budget deficits grew, and Bush at some point did raise tax rates. And then in 1992, when he was fighting for re-election against Bill Clinton, Clinton's campaign, his team, repeatedly ran that clip from 1988, okay, when George Bush had said, read my lips, no more taxes. He had broken that campaign promise. And, among the commentators, it is believed that this is one of the things which cost him quite a bit, that people thought that he has these empty promises. Economic policymakers, like the central bank governor, for example, often makes statements about the economy which are supposed to have immediate impact on investment climate, on the stock market, and so on. Just before the 2008 crash, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US, famously said, fundamentals of the economy are strong. This was soon followed by the collapse of Lehman Brothers and a financial meltdown. So another example of a verbal statement which turned out to be quite misleading or wrong. Experts make recommendations, yes. In India, we worry a lot about Moody's downgrading our sovereign debt rating from whatever, triple B plus to, I don't know, double C minus something. These guys, these rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and so on, they give out these ratings. Now, once again, if you look at the 2007-8 financial crisis, on the eve of the financial crisis, they were giving the topmost ratings to these credit-backed mortgages and these securities, which subprime lending, which turned out to be absolute junk. Yes. In the advertisements, companies make all kinds of claims. Fevicol heals everything. Fevicol has some classic ads, right? So sometimes they don't bother to say anything about Fevicol. They're just humorous, nice ads, but sometimes they do. Okay, so what does all of that amount to? So these are all examples of what is called cheap talk. Okay, why is it called cheap talk? Because it's different from standard signaling. You remember the Spence model, okay? Workers of high ability are trying to signal to employers that they are high ability, they'll be more productive, more valuable when they're hired, so they should be paid more. They're trying to make that argument in the job market. How do they make that argument? Through signaling. They undergo higher education, some tough course, right? Some master's degree, some PhD degree or something, which is costly, yes. And the argument is that, for the truly able types, the cost is less than the less able types. And that's why they are willing to signal that way, but the less able types are not, and that creates a separating equilibrium. Now, there also, if you think in abstract terms, what is being sent by the worker to the employers is a message, okay? But the message is not cheap, it's not costless. Getting that high-level degree is costly, and the cost differential is really a critical part of the story. The signaling is credible precisely because the cost is not the same for all the types. That's why some types are willing to undertake the cost and the other types are not. Cheap talk games are where the messages are costless in themselves. Their direct cost is zero for all types, okay? So a politician who secretly plans to raise taxes can costlessly make this statement, just as a politician who's truly a fiscal conservative and who will generally not raise taxes, right? For both types, saying read my lips, no more taxes is costless per se, right? Of course, George Bush paid a political price 4 years later for when he came up for re-election, but that's an indirect cost, okay? The message itself is not costly, whereas in the Spence model, the message itself, namely getting demanding master's degree, that message itself has a cost, okay? So that's why cheap talk, as opposed to costly messages, as in the Spence model. Questions? So we'll study these.
So what does it mean to have endogenous cost over here, as the last line says?
Okay. So one difference, I think the most major difference is that there's no direct cost in these cheap talk games that we're going to study. Okay, there are indirect costs. Okay, if I say something and then something happens, I break my promise or whatever, the reaction of the other players may put some cost on me. Okay, but how much that cost is going to be will depend on the nature of the equilibrium that arises. So that's the sense in which there are endogenous indirect costs, even in cheap talk games. That's why players may sometimes be disciplined into saying truthful things to some extent. Yes. So if you go back to the Spence model, the cost is exogenous, right? Right at the outset of the model, we assume that, okay, this is the cost of education for the high type, this is the cost of education for the low type. But even in that model, the benefits of signaling are endogenous. That's a feature of what kind of equilibrium comes about, whether it's a pooling equilibrium or a separating equilibrium, et cetera, et cetera. So in cheap talk models, although literally the direct cost is zero, indirectly speaking, some cost will emerge of sending one message versus another. But that cost is going to be endogenously determined by the equilibrium of the model. Yes? Does that, we'll see more as we go along, right? I mean,
Yeah, yes, sir, got it. Yeah, that clears the doubt. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so let's give one or two more examples to motivate our discussion and the model that is going to follow. We'll start off with the paper by Crawford and Sobel. It's a very famous paper, Econometrica 1982, which lays down a canonical model of cheap talk, or what they call strategic communication. So I'll discuss that model, but before that, another example or two. One example which is close to home is the business of professors writing recommendation letters for PhD applicants. So this is, that season just passed. In December, we are always scampering to write these letters for those of you who are applying for PhD degrees. Now, think about that, okay? I have a student, I'm writing a recommendation letter for her. The reason they've asked me to write these letters is that I have closer knowledge of the student's qualities, promises, knack, skills, intelligence, and so on, hardworking or not. Now, so the department to which the student is applying wants to pick the best among the applicants. So they want some objective assessment of each applicant from a professor who knows that applicant. But the professor has slightly distorted objectives, doesn't he? So, of course, if I am writing for a student and there's another student from another institution who's much, much better, right? There's a big gap. And I would prefer the better student go to Harvard. Yes, that's fair and that's socially. But if the other student from, let's say, ISI is only marginally better, if the other student is slightly better, then I may have some incentive to push my student over the other student, right? From my institution, if students from my institutions do well, get into Harvard or whatever, then we get some, at least bragging rights, if not anything else. So I'm a little bit biased relative to the graduate school who's asking my opinion. And therefore, I'm a little prone to exaggerating the true strength of my student, right? If the student is average, I am inclined to say above average. If the student is a bit above average, I'm inclined to say the student is excellent. And if the student is excellent, I'm inclined to say, once in 5 years, that sort of thing. Now, okay, I'll be exaggerating. Now, the people who are looking at these recommendation letters and deciding on who to make offers to, they're no fools, okay? They know this is going on. They know that, the writers of these recommendation letters are probably exaggerating a little bit about the student's quality. So they are going to discount what they read, okay? So if they read above average, they'll say, oh, this student is probably just average. If they read excellent, then they'll infer that, oh, this student is probably just a little bit above average. So they'll discount or mark down what has been written. They'll do a little bit of discounting there. Now, I'm no fool either. So, well, hopefully. So I know that they will discount what I say. So I exaggerate even more. Yes. Even for the average student, I say excellent. And for the excellent student, I say genius, the next Kenneth Arrow or something, the next Geeta Gopinath. And so you can see the nature of this game, right? Because they're going to discount, I want to exaggerate more. And because I'm exaggerating more, they want to discount even more. So Here's a question whose answer is not obvious at all. Is there any possibility of any kind of meaningful, informative communication in this situation? Okay. If we put our heads down and analyze this as a well-structured game, and if we follow game theoretic principles and solution concepts like Nash equilibrium, Bayesian Nash equilibrium, what can we say about the outcome of games like this, right? One possibility is that all communication may actually break down. I mean, I'll say something, but it'll be meaningless. They'll just ignore what I say. To every student, good, bad, average, I'll give the topmost rating, and they'll just throw it aside. They'll say this has no information content. He writes the same for everyone. Is that how the situation where we'll end up? Or is it possible for at least some amount of information to be meaningfully conveyed in spite of this bias which I have in writing my recommendation letters? Okay. Now, this sort of situation is quite pervasive. Yes. Take another example from the innards of government. All top decision makers, prime ministers, presidents, they have advisors of all kinds, right? However good they are not experts on everything. So they'll have economic advisors, they'll have military advisors, they'll have advisors on social policy and so on. Let's say there's a prime minister who has a national security advisor. Okay, and every year the prime minister has to decide how much to allocate to the defense budget. Okay. Now that, of course, ideally depends on conditions. Okay, if there's a strong external or internal security threat, then the defense budget should ideally be bigger. Everyone will agree with that. And if threat levels are low, then it should be smaller. Yes. Now, the prime minister may not be completely on top of all the information about the level of external threats, because the prime minister is looking at many different things. So the national security advisor meets with all the intelligence chiefs and pores over all the intelligence records, and then summarizes for the prime minister in his briefings what the level of the external threat is. Now, suppose the national security advisor is a defense hawk. Okay, so the question of how much money should be allocated to the defense budget out of the government's scarce resources, that depends on multiple things, actually. Yes, if you think about it. It depends, of course, on the reality on the ground, right? What is the level of external threat? That's certainly one component or one determinant of how much the defense budget should be. But it also depends on tastes and preferences and priorities of whoever is choosing. Some people are more, let's call them defense hawks, that for a given level of threat, they would want to allocate more resources compared to others to the defense budget. Some people are doves, let's say. They think that the money is better spent on the social sector, on infrastructure. So if the level of external threat was common knowledge, if there was no asymmetric information about that, people will disagree about what the size of the budget is, right? Hawks will want to spend more than doves. Just give me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Right, so in the story that I was just telling you, how big the defense budget should be is a question that requires, that depends on both actual information about the level of the external threat, as well as preferences or values or priorities. Okay. So the advisor may have different preferences from the prime minister. For example, the advisor may be more hawkish. So for the same level of threat, the advisor may want to allocate more resources than the prime minister to the defense budget. But both will agree that, you know, if the external threat level goes up, then their own respective optima will also increase, right? Both relative to what they earlier wanted, they would want more resources to be allocated to defense. So the same sort of insidious game will happen between this advisor and the prime minister. Because the advisor is more hawkish, he'll be prone to exaggerating the level of the threat than what is actually the case, so that the prime minister puts in more money in the defense budget. And the prime minister knows that, so the prime minister is prone to discounting the threat level which the advisor reports. And so you have that same cycle of exaggeration and discounting. And once again, without doing some careful game theoretic analysis, it is difficult to say where all this will end up, okay? Whether all information will get lost. So that's what the Crawford-Sobel model is all about. And you know, here are some quotations which kind of give you broad multiple perspectives on this. So Steven Pinker, he's a neuroscientist from or some sort of psychologist in Harvard. He has a number of books. One of them is called The Language Instinct, which is mostly about Chomsky's theory of language. So Pinker in his quote is marveling about our ability to communicate stuff to each other, right? The kind of complex thoughts and ideas that members of the human species convey to each other. You know, one of the sort of big difference between humans and others, you know, you take the great apes like chimpanzees or gorillas, they're pretty intelligent at the individual level. There's plenty of proof from field studies which shows how intelligent they are. One big difference is that humans can store and hand down knowledge from one generation to the next, right? If you think about all the information that you have gathered and you can have at your fingertips, from information in the library to Google, right? It's information collected by other members of your species, which you can tap into with very little effort. This is what other species are lacking. So Pinker is marveling at the power of language, or the potential of language to pass on information and let us build this sort of civilization and colonize the world. Walter Scott's quotation is kind of going the other direction and saying, oh, yes, people can say a lot of stuff to each other, but people often say deceptive things, false things, wrong things. And how do we separate the wheat from the chaff? And Yogi Berra, this is the great American sportscaster, he once said that an oral contract is not worth the paper it is written on. So that's a typical Berra is kind of, you're not very sure whether this is a profound statement or whether this is some stupid saying, kind of. But the spirit of it, if you take it seriously, is that that unless people are legally bound to what they're saying, unless they're subject to, you know, laws of libel or false advertisement, unless the messages are incorporated into legally binding contracts where there's a penalty for telling lies. If that is not the case, then any kind of verbal communication is basically useless because it will be not credible. Okay. Okay, before I start with the Crawford-Sobel model, let me just say that there are sort of two main aspects to language. One is meaning, and the other is credibility. Do I understand what the speaker is trying to tell me? That's about meaning. Okay? If the speaker is speaking in English or Hindi, yes, I do understand. If it's in a foreign language, which I don't know, then you know, I stumble at the very first block, which is I don't get that even meaning, what is being said. But if it's in a common language, often I understand the meaning, right? I go to a store and I'm trying to buy a watch, and the salesman says, you know, this will last you at least 10 years. I understand what he's saying, but do I believe him? So that's about credibility, yes. So the model that we're going to study is entirely based on credibility, right? Meaning is a different issue, and we'll just assume that there's no problem on the meaning front, that our agents that we are going to study, they understand each other. Do they believe each other is the question. Okay, so the Crawford-Sobel model is the simplest kind of communication game of this sort. Okay, it has two players. They're called sender, S, and receiver, R for short. There's a state of the world, theta. Okay, it's some unknown random variable. So in our advice game, theta is the threat level, external threat level, which the expert knows, but the decision maker, the prime minister, doesn't know. In the case of the student recommendation, theta is the quality of the student that the professor has seen, but the external, the graduate department to which the student is applying, they don't know what theta is. We'll assume theta is a random variable drawn from the uniform distribution on 0, 1. Nothing particularly hinges on the distribution being uniform. You know, we'll just get nice closed form solutions. So we'll take uniform distribution. So this fact that theta is drawn from the uniform distribution, that's common knowledge. So the receiver knows the distribution of theta, the range of possibilities is known. The difference between the sender and the receiver is that the sender gets to know the exact value of theta, the actual realization, whereas the receiver does not. Okay. There's an action to be chosen, and we'll assume that the action is also, you know, its domain is the 0, 1 interval. So again, for the two examples, so for example, the prime minister and the advisor example, think of the action as the size of the defense budget, the amount of money allocated to defense. Okay. So as I said, the sender gets to know the realization of theta. The receiver only knows the distribution. And as far as the action is concerned, the receiver has the authority or the power to choose the action. The sender has no power. There's no bargaining, nothing. The receiver is absolutely powerful. So what you see in this model is a very stark separation between information and authority. Okay, information and authority are vested completely in two different individuals. The receiver has the authority, the receiver has the full freedom to decide what the action should be, but the receiver lacks information about theta. Whereas the sender is very well informed about theta, but does not have decision-making authority. Okay, so that's the nice thing about this model, that it creates this sort of very stark setup, only two agents, information resides in one person, and decision-making authority resides in another person. They can talk before the game. Okay, so let's see how that talk is modeled. But before that, let's specify the preferences of the two agents. Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay. So here are the utility functions. So each agent's preference depends on both the action and the state of the world. Okay. Both the Prime Minister and the National Security Advisor cares about how much money was allocated to defense and what the actual external threat was. What was that level? Both will take, once again, most of the qualitative results do not particularly depend on this functional form. We are taking the so-called uniform quadratic version of the Crawford-Sobel model because it's easier to solve and we can get closed form solutions. So things are very tractable. In the original paper, if you go and read it, they have a much more general model and the results are proved for not these particular preferences, but more general preferences. Anyway, having said that, we'll stick to the uniform quadratic version. So this is the receiver's preference, the decision makers, and this is the experts or the sender's preference. Now, if you look closely at it, they're both minus some squared term. Okay, so the lowest value these utilities could take is 0. Otherwise, they're negative. In general, they're negative. Sorry, the highest value they can take is 0. Okay, so suppose theta is known. Let's think about what the receiver would want to do and what the sender would want to do. The receiver would want to choose the action exactly theta. The receiver gets highest utility when he manages to choose an action that matches the state of the world. Okay. Now the sender's optimal action is, what is B over here? B is a parameter, it's a fixed number. Okay. It represents the bias of the sender relative to the receiver. Okay. So treat it as a fixed number. A is the choice, the action to be chosen. So for the sender, if the sender somehow could choose the action, what is the action the sender would choose?
B plus theta.
B plus theta. Okay. The best you can do is have a utility of 0. Right. That's just normalization. 0 doesn't mean you're very unhappy. This model 0 means you're at your bliss point. Okay, so you can notice one thing, that when theta increases, the ideal action or the bliss point of both the players goes up. When there's a stronger security threat to the nation, both of them would ideally want to increase the defense budget. But for a given level of external threat, for a given value of theta, there is some degree of disagreement, and the degree of disagreement depends on the size of this parameter B. And that's why B captures the degree of conflict of interest between the two parties. Okay. Now, we are going to call B a bias, but that itself is a little bit of a biased term, right? What I mean by bias is not that, the sender is somehow evil or, has some wrong motives or preferences. It just means that the sender is biased relative to the receiver, which by the same token would mean that the receiver is biased relative to the sender. The sender is biased in the upward direction, and the receiver is biased in the downward direction relative to the other player. Okay, so no judgment involved in the term bias. B just captures how far apart their ideal points are. Okay, so what's the game? The game is the sender learns what theta is, the realization of theta. After learning that, the sender can send a cheap talk message, M, to the receiver. Okay. M can be anything. M can be a word, M can be a colored flag, M can be a number. Let's think of M as a real number. Okay. So theta is a real number, so M is also a real number, we can imagine. So sender sends this message to the receiver. Receiver hears the message. The receiver does some inferencing, right? What does that message mean? Does it tell me anything about what possible values of theta are? Can I narrow down the set of possibilities about theta? And then after drawing those inferences, the receiver chooses the action and the game ends. Yes. Payoffs are realized according to these payoff functions. So that's our game. That's called the cheap talk game. All right. Is it clear? Any questions? None?
Small question, sir.
Yes.
So can we look at B as the additional difference in the action that the sender wants the receiver to take? For example, I mean, that's what the bias would represent here, the additional exaggeration
That's right.
that the sender wants the receiver to act upon. Would that be right to think about it?
Yeah. So B is, suppose B is 1,000 crore rupees. So that means for at any threat level, whatever the prime minister wants the defense budget to be, the national security advisor, the sender, wants the budget to be larger than that by 1,000 crore rupees.
Got it, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Also, sir,
Yes.
sir, is it a necessary assumption to make that B is positive?
No, there's no such, we can do our entire analysis with B negative. It's just, this is entirely without loss of generality. Okay.
Okay.
So if B were negative, the construction would, we'll get a mirror image construction, okay, of the equilibrium. The equilibrium will just look like, as it's flipped in the mirror. Another assumption here is that B is supposed to be common knowledge, okay? So the two players know how much of a conflict of interest they have. That is common knowledge between them. Now, you could say that, there are many games where I don't even know if this guy is biased or not, okay? But one thing at a time. The thing with modeling is that we don't want to throw in all kinds of possibilities right at the outset. We want to understand things step by step. So the question here is going to be, if the conflict of interest between the speaker and the listener was well known to them, to themselves, then what kind of communication arises from that situation? Yeah. Okay, let me illustrate a little more what these utility functions are like. The picture is a bit wrong. First of all, these question marks, I could never get the theta. Right? So every question mark is basically a theta. Okay, so fix a value of theta. All right. What I have drawn is the utility graph, the payoff graph of the receiver. Okay. It peaks at theta. Really, the zero axis should have been here, but make that mental adjustment. Yes, this is not really zero. This is a negative number. So for any given theta, the utility of the receiver peaks when the action chosen. So this on this axis, we are taking action as well as the state of the world, right? Both are being measured on the horizontal axis. So obviously, when the action chosen is exactly theta, the state of the world, that's where we have a peak. Now, for the same theta, if we draw the utility graph for the sender, what will that look like? That'll also be a single peaked graph like this, but it'll be shifted further to the right. Isn't that so? Because of the bias factor B. So the red graph is for the receiver, for the same theta, okay? So the receiver's utility peaks at theta plus B instead of theta. Now, what happens if theta itself goes up? the level of external threat, objectively speaking, has increased. Well, these graphs, these utility graphs will shift to the right. So for the receiver, it will shift further to the right to some theta prime. Theta prime is the new value of the state of the world. It's higher than the earlier theta. And the red graph will also shift like this. Theta, now it's theta prime plus b. Okay. So we go back a couple of slides. So for any given theta, another thing to know and understand is the following. If the action choice is less than theta, okay, then it's Pareto inefficient. Then increasing the action would make both sender and receiver better off. Similarly, if the action choice is greater than theta plus b, then again it's Pareto inefficient. Decreasing the action would make both parties better off. Okay, so there are ranges of values of action which are simply inefficient for the given state of the world. Yes, so in that sense, there is a considerable amount of common interest between the speaker and the listener, right? They are both interested in avoiding these zones below theta, actions below theta, actions above theta plus b. Yes. However, in the interval between theta and theta plus b, they have a conflict of interest. They're pulling in opposite directions. Yes. Starting from any point, the receiver would like the action to be lower and the sender would like it to be higher. Okay. So overall, this game has both conflict and common interest, which is what makes games interesting. So the question, in some sense, the overarching question is, to what extent will they manage to avoid these inefficient actions, which are inefficient for both of them? They're Pareto inefficient, and at least get an action which is from the conflict zone rather than the common interest zone. Yes. Can they avoid staying off inefficient choices? And you'll see they cannot. I mean, the answer is no. Yes, but we'll get there. Okay, this slide is a bit abstract. I'm not going to, so let me just speak in plain English, what this slide is talking about. It's a well-defined game, right? And what we want to study is the perfect Bayesian equilibrium of this game, as we are doing for a lot of models and analysis, right? That's the appropriate solution concept because it's a sequential move game of incomplete information. So this is the least, you don't want to look at Nash equilibrium. You don't want to look at subgame perfection. This is the minimum you want to require of your equilibrium, perfect Bayesian. Okay, what does it consist of? First of all, we have to specify the strategies and all, right? And then what conditions these strategies need to satisfy. So the sender strategy is a message function. For every possible state of the world, what is the message the sender sends out, right? That mapping, that function is the sender's strategy. Receiver strategy. Now, receiver will have some belief, okay? The receiver will update in his mind the distribution of theta, the set of possible values of theta and their probabilities, conditional on n. So it's possible that, what message I hear shapes what I think is the distribution of theta. So this function is the receiver's belief function. And then the receiver has some strategy. For every message the receiver hears, the receiver has to decide what action to choose, and the action could depend on the message. We have to allow for that. So these are the three pieces, okay, of the construction of an equilibrium. What is the message strategy of the sender? What is the action strategy of the receiver? And what is the belief function of the receiver? Okay, these three pieces, once we specify, we are looking at a candidate equilibrium. Now, what do these have to satisfy for it to be a valid perfect Bayesian equilibrium? Okay, every perfect Bayesian equilibrium consists of three pieces like this, but unless those three pieces satisfy some properties, they are not really an equilibrium. So what are the properties? First of all, the sender has to be playing a best response, okay? If we take as given what the receiver strategy is, then the sender's message strategy has to be optimal for the sender for every theta, okay? That's what this line says. The receiver, jumping to the last line, the receiver's action strategy also has to be optimal given the receiver's beliefs. After every message, the receiver updates beliefs about theta, and using those beliefs, the action chosen ought to be optimal. Okay, so sender has to be playing a best response, receiver has to be playing a best response given its beliefs, and finally, the beliefs have to be rational whenever possible. So every message strategy, every message which is supposed to arrive in equilibrium, we can apply Bayes' rule for such messages. And so beliefs have to be based on the actual strategy of the sender using Bayes' rule. We'll see this in action in a moment. Yes, so in general terms, this is what a perfect Bayesian equilibrium of this model will be like. Okay, now let's actually try to find some equilibrium. All right. There's one equilibrium which always exists. It's a perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And it's called the babbling equilibrium. Okay. What is this equilibrium like? Well, the sender strategy is a mesh strategy where it is independent of theta. For example, the sender could always mention a number regardless of what theta actually is. Another strategy could be, for example, he always says half. Whether theta is low or high, closer to 0, closer to 1, doesn't matter, he always says half, okay? So in the babbling equilibrium, the sender's message strategy is state independent. Anyway, it's state independent. What are the beliefs of the receiver? The beliefs of the receiver is basically the initial prior distribution. Okay, before any message was heard, the receiver believed that theta is drawn from the uniform distribution, 0, 1. That belief does not change. It remains the same no matter what message he hears. And the receiver's strategy is to choose the action half, which is the expected value of theta. One thing which I should have mentioned is if you look at the utility function we have chosen, the so-called quadratic loss function, okay, right here, you can show, of course, when theta is known, when the receiver has a point estimate of theta, his optimal action is equal to theta. That's easy to see. What if the receiver at some point has information which creates a probability distribution for theta? Okay, for example, theta is uniformly distributed between 0, 1, or theta is uniformly distributed between 0, half, whatever, takes any distribution. If theta follows a distribution in the receiver's mind, what is the optimal action choice of the receiver? The optimal action will be the expected value of theta. Okay, I'm not going to prove that. I'll leave it to you to prove, but it's easy to prove. So prove it. Okay, that in the case of uncertainty, optimal action is equal to the expected value of theta. Yes. Okay. So back to the babbling equilibrium that I was describing. Sender strategy, send a message independent of theta. Beliefs don't change at all after hearing the message. And the receiver strategy is to choose the ex ante expected value of theta, which is half. Okay. Now, it's easy to see this is a valid equilibrium. intuitively what's happening in this equilibrium. What's happening is that the receiver expects the sender's message or what the sender says to contain no meaningful information. So that's why the receiver ignores the sender's message altogether and just chosen what he would have chosen anyway if he didn't hear anything. And the sender knows that the receiver just ignores him. So the sender has no incentive to pass on any meaningful information. He knows that whatever he says, he'll be ignored. So he says something random. He just, always says the same thing. If speakers expect that listeners won't pay any attention to what they're saying, they don't say meaningful things. And since they're not saying meaningful things, receivers don't pay any attention to them, so they can get trapped in this equilibrium of meaninglessness or whatever, of complete erosion of any meaningful information. That is always an equilibrium. So it's called a babbling equilibrium. The sender just babbles meaninglessly. So for every value of the bias factor P, a babbling equilibrium exists. This includes B equal to 0. B equal to 0 is a special case where they see completely eye to eye. Actually, there's no conflict of preference between them. Even then, we have a babbling equilibrium. Yes? Any questions?
Sir, I just have a clarificatory question. So here, why don't we have action as 0 or 1 and in between from 0 to 1? Like, how can an action be half?
If the thing being chosen is a continuous variable, think about the example which I gave, which is choosing the defense budget. Okay, the amount of money you put into the defense budget is not a binary choice. It's a continuous choice.
Okay.
Yes. I hope I haven't played the babbling equilibrium with you guys. So is it clear so far? Okay, so the babbling equilibrium always exists in the Crawford-Sobel model. If that were the only equilibrium, things wouldn't have been terribly interesting. So obviously the fact that we're talking about it means that maybe there are other equilibria. Yes. And indeed there is, at least for some parameter values. So the next equilibrium we'll look at is an equilibrium in which the information is partitioned into two intervals. Okay. So let's say the boundary of the two intervals is theta t. Okay, so the equilibrium takes the following form. The sender sends one message when theta is less than theta t, when it's between 0 and theta t, if it's below the threshold. And he sends a completely different distinct message m2 when theta lies above the threshold theta t. Okay, so the message, whether the message heard is m1 or m2, tells the receiver at least some information, namely whether theta lies in the lower interval or in the higher interval. Okay, so we're trying to construct an equilibrium of this form, where the sender strategy is this kind of binary message strategy. Okay, what are receivers' beliefs?
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
So in this M can be truth as well, right? We are not excluding that possibility here. Or are we just assuming that it is always cheap talk?
No, it is always cheap talk in the sense that I mentioned, that the message itself is costless. Okay. Now, M1 can't literally be the truth because we are talking of a whole range of values of theta. For each of them, it's the same message, right? So the message is not literally equal to theta, clearly, right? But in these models, what matters really is not what the message literally is. So let's say theta t is 0.4, right? So then that means the sender's message strategy is below 0.4, he says something. Above 0.4, he says something else. Think of M1 and M2 being even words, not even numbers. So if theta is below 0.4, the sender cries out, theta is low. And when it's above 0.4, he says theta is high. So low and high are the two messages. Okay.
Got it,
If
got it.
you make them words, we don't have to worry about them, whether they match the numerical value of theta.
So,
Yes.
so is this theta t an exogenously given value, or is this determined within?
No. It's absolutely endogenous. That is absolutely critical. It is this value, and we'll try to solve for this value in just a moment.
Okay.
Yes. It has to be carefully chosen so that the whole thing works as an equilibrium. If you assign a random number as theta t, it won't work. Some of one or the other player will have a profitable deviation. Yes. So we'll see how we can pin down the value of theta t. For now, let's just postulate there is some theta t. Okay. So what do the receiver's beliefs have to be? The beliefs are like this. Okay. Since the beliefs have to be, consistent with the sender strategy, obviously the beliefs will be that, when I hear M1 as a message as a receiver, I immediately know that, theta lies in this interval, and it has to be, the original distribution was uniform, so this is also uniform. Okay. And when theta is M2, or let's say any other value apart from M1, including off the equilibrium path messages, right? Messages which are not supposed to be uttered, but put all of them together. Any other message apart from M1, the receiver believes that theta is uniformly distributed between theta t and 1. Okay. So the receiver is extracting the right information from the message, okay, using the fact that the sender is using this sort of interval-based strategy. Now, the last thing to make sure, so already we have, we have specified the strategy, we have specified the beliefs. The beliefs are constructed so that they're rational beliefs.
So I had a small question on the
Yes.
previous slide. So why do we consider the case of the message being anything apart from M1 or M2? I mean, within the model, these are the only two messages that we've taken that the sender would be sending.
Because one of the things in game theory is off the equilibrium path messages. So suppose a player, I'm playing a game with you, and you have three actions to choose from, left, middle, and right. Okay, and I get to see what you have chosen. No, I don't get to see what you've chosen. Okay. So when I get the move, I get to see what you've chosen, right? And suppose we are looking at an equilibrium where you either choose middle or right, you never choose left. But then as we play the game, suppose I encounter a left move. Okay, your equilibrium actions are supposed to be either middle or right, but you could deviate. You could deviate and play left. And then the next player has to decide what the meaning of this deviation is. Okay. Remember, in game theory, strategies are a description of all possible situations, including those situations which are not supposed to arise. Yes. Now, why is that important? Because how people behave is very much shaped by what could have been. The first player, when you're making the choice in equilibrium, you're supposed to choose middle or right, but you have to ask yourself what would happen. How will the professor react if I choose left and he sees me choosing left? So a complete description of any equilibrium has to involve a specification of what players will do and what players will believe if they see something that is not supposed to happen, which is not part of the equilibrium strategy of the other players. You see that everywhere. You see that when you do the Spence model. Okay, in the Spence model, you study the pooling equilibrium, for example, if you recall your lessons. You know, there's a pooling equilibrium where neither party chooses education. To complete description of that equilibrium and make sure that it's a valid equilibrium, we have to ask and answer the question, what would have happened if somebody deviated and chose education, which they're not supposed to choose? What will the employers believe when they see that? What kind of wages will they pay? And so on. This is absolutely fundamental to game theory. The description of an equilibrium has to include what happens in terms of beliefs and actions of the equilibrium path, right? When play somehow deviates into a path where it was not supposed to go. And unless we have a clear specification of that, we cannot judge whether on the equilibrium path, players are acting optimally or not. Yes? Now, I'm giving you a general answer. I mean, without sort of completely going over the relevant game theory lessons, I can't give a fuller answer, but I hope at least this sort of rehashes one of the fundamental things. In any case, no harm, right? I'm just describing an equilibrium for you where I'm being completely exhaustive. I'm telling you what the beliefs will be for messages M1 and M2, but also any other messages. They're all treated at par with M2. It is as if M2 was the message.
Yeah, got it, sir. Thank you.
Okay, now let's come to the receiver's strategy. Just need to check the time. Oh, I have to hurry up. Okay, so let's see how we can, sorry, before that I need to, so the receiver strategy is going to be simple. From the message, the receiver can tell which interval theta lies in. Okay. As I said, the optimal action for the receiver always, after updating his beliefs, is to choose the conditional expectation of theta. That is always the optimal action. So when he learns that theta lies in the lower interval, because the message was M1, he'll have to choose the midpoint of that interval. Okay. Given uniform distribution, the expectation is always the midpoint of the relevant interval. Yes. So when the message is M1, the optimal action for the receiver is theta t by 2, okay, average of 0 and theta t. And when the message is M2 or something else, his optimal action would be the midpoint of the higher interval, which is this. Okay. Now, let me skip to the picture. And let's see how we can pin down theta t. To pin down theta t, we'll basically use an indifference property or condition. In all these threshold type models, right? At the threshold, the player should be indifferent. Anyway, let me explain what I mean. So here's the starting point. Okay, this is the sender strategy, that below theta t it sends message M1, above theta t it sends message M2. This is known. This is what the receiver believes. Okay, so when he hears M1, the receiver chooses what action? He chooses the midpoint of the lower interval because he knows it lies on the lower interval. And when he hears the M2 message, he knows it's in this upper interval, he chooses the midpoint of that. So those values are half theta t and half 1 plus theta t. Okay, now the last thing to check is whether the sender is happy to follow this message strategy or not. This message strategy has to be a best response for the sender, which means for every theta, he has a reason to stick to his message strategy, meaning that when theta is indeed in this lower interval, the sender is better off sending the message M1. He would be worse off if he sent the wrong message M2. He's free to do so, but it won't be in his interest. And similarly, when theta lies in this upper interval, for all those values of theta, he must be preferring the message M2 instead of M1. Which is basically saying that for all these theta values, the sender likes the action, this midpoint, better than the other midpoint. And for this entire range, he likes this midpoint better than that. Because the sender essentially faces a situation where all the power he has is through his message, he can essentially decide whether this midpoint is chosen or that midpoint is chosen. So in the lower interval, he must prefer this first midpoint, and in the upper interval, he must prefer the midpoint of that upper interval. This property has to hold. Okay. Now, by continuity, you can infer what should happen at the threshold. What if theta is exactly theta t? It falls exactly on that threshold. Okay. Since to the left of it, the sender should prefer the left midpoint, and to the right of that, he should prefer the right midpoint. Then at the threshold, he should be indifferent between these 2 points. Okay. That is by continuity of the utility function. At the threshold, he should, whichever message he sends should give him the same utility. Now, what does that mean? That means when theta is at the threshold, what is the ideal choice action of the receiver? What is his bliss point?
So he would be indifferent, maybe.
No, what is his bliss point? If he somehow could choose the action himself, what would he have chosen? He has learned that the actual value of theta is theta t. It has fallen right on the threshold. Now, what does the sender ideally want to choose?
So the
So b
second
plus theta t.
What plus theta t?
B plus theta t.
That's right. Yeah, theta t plus b. That's his bliss point. So he would ideally want this action, but he doesn't. He doesn't have that much power. So his choice is basically restricted to these two, and he's indifferent between these two, which means his bliss point is equidistant from these two actions. Only then will he be indifferent, right? Only then his utility value. Now, the utility function is symmetric around the bliss point. And so therefore, that's why these 2 points ought to be equidistant from his bliss point. Okay. Now, that is a mathematical condition we can easily write down. The distance between theta t plus b and half of theta is the same as the distance between theta t plus b and half 1 plus theta t. Okay. So from that, we can solve for theta t. And it turns out to be half minus 2b. So once again, we can construct this partition equilibrium where theta is divided into 2 intervals and 2 messages are customized to those 2 intervals. Such an equilibrium can exist. We can identify what the cutoff value is going to be, and the cutoff value is half minus 2b. Now, some parameter condition is needed, okay? For this equilibrium to be meaningful, this cutoff we have calculated has to genuinely lie in the 0-1 interval, okay? Now, if it turns out to be negative, and it can only be negative, right? It's half minus something. So it can never be more than 1, but it can be less than 0. So if this number turns out to be negative, then this is a meaningless solution. That means this sort of equilibrium then does not exist. But as long as this is a positive number, it is a consistent equilibrium. So we need B less than 1/4 for this sort of equilibrium to exist. Okay. So if the bias is too big, if the conflict of interest is too big, then we only have the babbling equilibrium. But if we have a conflict of interest which is not too big, specifically if it's less than 1/4, that's strictly positive, then we can have this two-message equilibrium. And in the two-message equilibrium, there is some meaningful information being conveyed. Yes. I'll come back to this point. Let me skip to the next slide and let's see what we have learned so far. Okay. The equilibrium is informative but coarse. What is happening in this equilibrium is some information is being conveyed, but not fine information. The receiver doesn't get to learn the exact value of theta. The receiver is able to classify theta into one of two boxes, right? It learns that it's either some sort of low range or some high range. So receiver learns something from the conversation, but not everything. That's one of the features of this equilibrium. For a two-message equilibrium, it is necessary but not sufficient that the sender's bias is not too large. So take values of B, which is less than 1/4, okay? There we have two equilibria. We have the babbling, at least two equilibria, the babbling equilibrium and this two-interval thing that we have constructed. So there's still an issue of equilibrium selection. Which of these two will be played, okay? So having a relatively low conflict of interest, low value B, is of course necessary for any kind of meaningful communication, but it's not in itself sufficient. So useful information exchange depends on both incentives and coordination. Even when B is low, they have to coordinate onto that two-interval equilibrium instead of the babbling one, right? So there's a coordination issue there. Another thing is the equilibrium interval lengths are right skewed. Information gets more garbled in the direction of bias, okay? So the left interval, here the bias is in the rightwards direction, right? There's a tendency to exaggerate, not underplay. So what that leads to is a smaller interval on the left and a larger interval on the right, okay? So for example, when the advisor is a defense hawk, the advisor can, when theta is very, very low, the advisor can kind of much more meaningfully convey that, okay? So when a hawk says, Prime Minister, you don't have to worry about the external threat because we are in a very peaceful situation, that message is much more credible because the national security advisor is prone to exaggeration, prone to create a scare, so as to increase the defense budget. So when he says that, oh, threat levels are not that high, that is much easier to believe. That's why the left interval is small, whereas the right interval is much bigger, because even when threat perceptions are kind of middling or lowish, he still wants to exaggerate. So there's a lot of possibilities get lumped together in the high message. Okay, so the hawkish advisor saying, oh, things are bad, we face a lot of threats. That message is weak. It covers a lot of possibilities. Similarly, professors who are prone to exaggerating the quality of the students, if that professor says, oh, this student is really bad, then they'll believe the professor. When the professor says, oh, this student is pretty good, they think that covers a whole range of possible student qualities. Yeah. So that's another thing we have learned. Information gets garbled. Categories are bigger in the direction of bias. Okay. And the last point is an additional source of welfare loss is these unequal intervals. So if I go back to the previous slide, this last point is based on the following exercise. Okay. I'll just describe the exercise for you. Suppose the suppose two intervals are the only possibility. Okay, suppose the message is binary, just by its very nature. Suppose all that a sender has, let's say the sender has no bias, for example, and the sender doesn't have a rich message space. The sender has only two colors, which you can either hold up a red card or a blue card. This is all he's allowed to do. So by construction, the message is binary. Okay. So the sender and receiver beforehand decide on what the message strategy should be. Okay. In particular, they have to decide what threshold below which to show the blue message and above which to show the red message. So that is an optimization problem. Okay. Where should you pin X so that with a binary message, the value of information is maximized? Okay. Now, that means it's maximizing this maximization problem. And what you can show is that the optimal threshold is half. So if the message has to be binary, the value of the information is maximized when the two intervals are symmetric. You can look at this problem and see why that is the case. So in the actual two-interval equilibrium that we have just looked at, there is an additional source of welfare loss. Not only is the message coarsened endogenously, not technologically, not that the sender is only given two colors which you can flash. You can say all kinds of things. His message space is actually quite rich, but due to incentive reasons in this equilibrium, he is reduced to basically two messages. Right now, things wouldn't have been as bad if the two messages were constructed in this symmetric fashion. Below half, there's one message, above half, there's another message. But that's not the case. Okay, it's half minus 2b, that's the threshold. So the intervals are unequal. And because of that unequal interval, that's an additional source of loss to the receiver. You can look at that at the extreme. Suppose half minus 2b, suppose 2b is almost half. So half minus 2b is almost close to 0. Okay. So if the threshold is extreme left, that is almost useless, because yes, once in a while you'll get very precise information as the receiver that theta falls in a very tiny left interval, and then it'll be very useful. Okay, you can choose an action which is the midpoint of the tiny interval, so you're very close to this point. But most of the time, with very high probability, you'll learn next to nothing. You learn that instead of theta being between 0 and 1, it's between some small positive number and 1. And that's not going to help you much in terms of choosing an action which is customized to the state of the world. Okay, so that's the last point, that conflict of interest between speaker and listener still allows room for some meaningful information being conveyed. That's good news, that's a positive news. But the information gets coarsened, like it gets, instead of knowing the exact value of theta, you only learn some interval. And moreover, these intervals are not symmetric, they're skewed, and that's an additional source of welfare loss or information loss. Questions?
So I have a small question on the last point that